Welcome to another scientific session with Tope. In the last episode, we looked at the immune system. We talked about how organisms can pose a threat to the body and how the immune system, using its innate and adaptive components, helps defend our bodies from these threats. We talked about the concept of vaccination, the different types of vaccines, and how vaccines can essentially provide our immune system with tools to better defend our bodies from these threats. Well, in today's episode, we'll be pulling our magnifying glasses out and essentially looking at what these organisms are that can pose a threat to our bodies and our immune systems. In the last episode, you would have noticed that I used the word pathogen quite a lot. We got to understand that pathogens are essentially organisms which pose a threat to our health, to our well-being, to our bodies. And so in today's video, we'll be looking at three major types of pathogens. Those are bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Let's start with bacteria. Did you know that in terms of mass, bacteria outweigh human beings by 1,000 times to 1? Well, what that means is if you took every single human being on Earth, all 8.5 plus billion of us, and put us on the right side of a scale, and were somehow able to gather every single bacterium on the planet and put them on the left side, the left side will drop down very rapidly because it will completely outweigh the right side. I'm sure that is so mind-boggling because, bacteria are microorganisms. We can't even see them. They're so tiny. Well, that's because bacteria are everywhere. They're literally everywhere. They're on our tables, on our chairs, on the ground, on the floor, in the toilet seat, on our kitchen counters, in our mouth, in our gut, in our digestive system, in our ears. They are literally everywhere. They're in the soil. They're everywhere. And this is because bacteria, for the most part, play really critical roles in ensuring that the vital functions for life to continue to exist are continued. Bacteria play very critical roles. They only become a problem when bacteria that should be in place A end up in place B where they're not supposed to be. Bacteria are unicellular. They essentially consist of one cell. They're known as prokaryotes because unlike our natural body cells, they don't have nucleuses and other organelles like ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi bodies, etc. They just have the cell membrane, they have the genetic material and protein within that single cell, and then some of them have little appendages that help them move around or attach to stuff if they need to do so. And they are quite nifty with what they do, single cells, but they're able to survive quite well. Now, when the wrong bacteria gets into the wrong place, it can cause a lot of problems. Again, did you know that we have our own natural flora of bacteria? It's called the gut microbiome. Our gut, or our digestive system, actually has quite a lot of bacteria, and that bacteria is so important for gut health, it's so important for our digestive health, and it's also important for our mental health. That's an interesting one that we can come to at another time. But say a bacteria that's important for soil fertility gets into the body where it's not supposed to, then it can make you very sick because now this bacteria can go attach itself to your normal cells and then cause the normal cells to die or get really sick. It can also release toxins within the body that again cause your cells to die. And then they replicate quite rapidly within the body, causing serious infections. And that's why the body tries to respond. You get a bit of a fever, the immune system tries to do its thing. And most times, your body can, to an extent, fight against this bacteria. But then there are times when an infection is a bit more severe. And then the doctor would typically prescribe you with antibiotics. Antibiotics are essentially antibacterial compounds. They are against bacteria. And they work in two ways. They could be bacteriostatic or bacteriocytic. Bacteriostatic antibiotics prevent bacterium from replicating. So if you get infected by 50 bacterium and you take a bacteriostatic antibiotic, it will try and ensure that it restricts it to that 50. That way your body is able to quickly get rid of those 50 bacterium. Bactericidal antibiotics actually go in and kill bacteria. There's a further classification of antibiotics, which are broad spectrum and narrow spectrum antibiotics. Broad spectrum antibiotics are indiscriminate. They go in and they kill any bacteria or as many bacterium as they can find. Narrow spectrum antibiotics are a lot more specific, so they know, oh, there's one or two specific bacteria that I need to go for, and they search for them and they go in and actually address those specific bacteria, and they're typically the better types of antibiotics. Another concept when it comes to bacterium, and one that has been a cause of quite serious debate over the last few years, and I guess actually it's become a lot more relevant in the last couple of decades, is the concept of bacterial resistance. This is because a lot of bacteria are starting to evolve to evade or cope a lot better with antibiotics, essentially meaning they get treated with antibiotics and they just don't die, so the infection doesn't go away. This is a really, really bad sign. It's an ominous sign, and it's something that has been really troubling for the scientific community and is actually troubling for the general public as well, if you understand how devastating that can be, having bacteria that cannot be killed by antibiotics. And that's why it's so important that if your doctor prescribes you with an antibiotics and says, take this antibiotic for 5 days and don't have any alcohol, please follow that script. Do not take it for 2 days and say, oh geez, you know what, I feel a lot better, so I'm going to stop. Well, all that does is it means that the antibiotic or the bacteria that have survived those first 2 days have a chance to develop resistance to the antibiotic that was used, and in the future they may be a lot tougher to deal with. So it's super important that you follow the script. Another thing that doctors try to do now is not prescribe antibiotics unless it's a more severe infection. That way we just try to discourage bacterium from developing that resistance. The next pathogen that we will be talking about is viruses, or are viruses. We talked about viruses quite briefly in the last video, and as you would have realized if you watched that video, is that they are quite nasty organisms. But here's a fun fact. Viruses have been a cause of really contentious debate in the scientific community for a number of years. And this is because people or scientists still don't know, there's no complete consensus on if viruses are living organisms or not. Are they alive or are they dead? This is because outside of a host, viruses essentially are non-functional. They only come to life when they get into a host. They're not real cells. They consist of protein or lipid capsules that envelope genetic material. And so you have something that is essentially a capsule that has some genetic material. It does nothing outside of a host, but then once it enters a host, it is extremely devastating. What viruses do is that they invade the body's cells. They don't just go into a host and start to replicate outside. They invade the cells, take over the cell's reproductive machinery, and use that to reproduce very rapidly. When they've reproduced and got into a certain stage of certain amount of viruses, they essentially burst open that cell, say freedom, and spread and go infect other cells. And that's why they're quite prevalent within fluids. The reason why a person with flu would sneeze and release viral spores, because those viruses have been released from their cells. And that's also why it's quite difficult to treat viruses, because essentially you have to kind of get to them considering the fact that they are inside the cell and not just moving around the body freely. There's a few different types of viruses, and typically the way that they tend to treat them is, or we tend to address them, is by trying to equip the immune system to get rid of them because, again, they're inside the cells, so it's harder to just send a drug in to go and like get rid of them. So typically you're trying to bolster the immune system, get it strong enough to go and get rid of the virus, or try and put in preventative measures such as vaccination prior, so that the immune system can very quickly get rid of this virus before it is able to invade the cells and start to reproduce. But for a few viruses, they actually have drugs that can address them, and they're called antivirals. Antivirals could either go in and kill the viruses, or they do something known as, again, almost like bacteriostatic antibiotics. They prevent the viruses from replicating. And that is the case for some of the most prevalent viruses. A few examples of viruses that we know and diseases that they cause include the influenza virus, which causes the flu. We talk about the influenza virus all the time. I'm sure you guys heard of the Ebola virus. That was a real nasty virus, and you obviously don't want to deal with that. The common cold, we always thought, oh, geez, I have a cold. Well, that's caused by a virus known as the rhinovirus. Did you know that? Then we have other viruses such as HPV. We have HIV, which is a very peculiar virus because it invades the immune cells. So HIV doesn't just invade, say, respiratory cells like your flu would do. It actually invades the immune cells that are supposed to protect the body from viruses. And so you can imagine that causes a bit of a problem because it's destroying the immune cells, and for the immune cells to get to it, they kind of need to destroy themselves. So I'm sure that starts to, give you an idea of why it's been so difficult to come up with a cure for HIV, because how do you protect the immune cells whilst destroying something that's inside the immune cells or that targets the immune cells? And so it's dealt with by using antiretrovirals, which essentially try to prevent the HIV virus from replicating. That way you don't develop full AIDS because your immune cells are able to regenerate, and now you have a very small amount of HIV that's hidden somewhere in some of the immune cells, but you also have a lot of healthy immune cells that can go about and do their various functions. The third major type of pathogen that I'll be talking about are parasites. Now, parasites, I would actually argue that all pathogens are parasites because they have parasitic properties or characteristics. But then there's a subsection of pathogens that are classified as actual parasites. And they tend to, live and thrive in things that we love to do, things that we love to eat, in our chicken, in our meat, etc. These parasites and are the reasons why you are advised to prepare your foods really well, ensure that you're cooking them thoroughly, and also ensure that you practicing hygienic practices to ensure that you're not exposing yourself to parasites. They can live out either outside or inside our bodies. External parasites include fleas, ticks. I'm sure you heard about those. You wouldn't think of those as, parasites, but they are. Ringworm, that's a parasite. You have fungi, like the fungus that causes athlete's foot, a really smelly and undesirable parasite to have. And then you have more internal parasites like your intestinal worms. You also have the quite famous parasite, which is the malaria parasite. And parasites are typically treated using antiparasitic drugs, which go in and actually kill the parasites. So those are the three main types of pathogens. If you've learned something, please go ahead and leave a comment. In the next episode, we'll be dealing with threats to the body which may not necessarily be external, such as lack of sleep. Did you know that this could actually affect your body and your immune system? If you'd like to know more, please go ahead and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.